John, I appreciate you coming on, man. This has been a long time in the making. Anybody listening right now, we have the 2023 Educator of the Year from the NSCA, John McMahon, on the podcast. John, thanks for being on, brother.
Thank you very much for the invite, Justin. It's good to meet you properly this time. For those that don't know, I work for Hawkin Dynamics. I'm the Director of Innovation, and obviously data is a big part of what we do. It's the main part of our business. We have thousands of trials that are being put through our force plates and our true strength device every single day. So it's obviously a huge part of being a sports science and technology company effectively. And what we have in our back end is all of these trials coming in for our customers to be able to obviously use that to inform what their athletes and patients need in terms of return to sport, fatigue monitoring, physical profiling, and looking at that whole neuromuscular piece. But what we also do is make sure that that data is never used by our company, right? So we have safeguards in place where our customers are completely aware that our data that we use is only ever going to be used through contracts that we have with individual companies, PhD students and things like that, and never their individual data. And so I would like to begin just by making that clear that for us as a company, security is probably the most important thing from a data perspective when we've got so many units out there being used now on a daily basis across the military, across healthcare professions, across universities, like all of these that have huge ethical dimensions associated with them when it comes to how that data is actually harvested and used and stored. Obviously, we're an international company, so we've got to ensure that wherever our products are being used, that we have that governance in place to make sure that that data is protected, period. And to be fully compliant, like we are, like we do have to make sure that we have all of that documented in the back end with our compliance and contracts manager. And we know that we're confident as a company and that our customers are confident that that data just doesn't get used. It's as simple as that. Lots of companies will use their customers' data, sometimes without them even knowing. But that's always been something that Hawkin Dynamics has never done and never will do. And is the reason why we're trusted by, combine events, by universities, the military, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of boring to talk about, I guess. So maybe for the podcast, it's important to say that obviously with the data that people are collecting, it's data that really belongs to them only, not to the company. I think that's the way that we position ourselves, that although we enable that data to be collected, it doesn't belong to us. We're just a vehicle for you to collect the data that's meaningful for your athletes and your patients. And then what you do with it then is completely your deal and not ours, effectively.
Let's talk about the quality of data, because I've said it before on the show where bad data collected improperly is worse than no data. And for some of our listeners out there, that might be the first time they've ever heard it, where like they need to understand if you're getting data that's either invalid or it's, collected improperly, you're going to be giving, it's worse than not having any. Can you expand upon that in your expertise?
Yeah, of course. It's a huge challenge. I think for the last 10 years, as sport technology has really boomed, there's been a lot of collecting data, but not very much progression as a profession in terms of how to action that data with the athlete and patients at the center of why we're collecting that data in the first place. And so we're very good at collecting numbers as a profession in sport and exercise science and medicine. But a lot of people don't critically evaluate what those numbers actually mean, or even where those numbers come from. So if we take normative data as an example, which is something that we could do, right? We could get all of our data from our system. Not that we do, because I've already explained that we don't, but we could, in theory, if we wanted to exploit that. We could get all of the data in our system and say, hey, Justin, here's some normative data for a counter movement jump for insert any athlete, any subgroup of that athlete population that you're going to compare your athlete's data to. But like you just said a moment ago, the actual inputs into how that data was compiled in the first place is the biggest source of error. So what I mentioned at the beginning, which was the more boring part, but sometimes the less obvious bit, is that the data security and compliance and ownership is really important for us to ethically be able to sell and provision our products. But then the actual data that we do collect has to be of the highest quality standards. So if I'm personally in charge of collecting my data, I know what the athlete's done beforehand in terms of familiarization, whether they're motivated, the warm-up, the verbal cues I've given, the surface that I've placed the force plates on, the way in which they've executed the jump, whether or not they've done a weigh-in period, the sample frequency, like the literal list goes on and on and on. And the problem is that if you would just be completely blind to that and naively just take normative data without that critical evaluation, that's where it becomes a problem, because then you're in a situation where you're effectively comparing the things that you know about how you've collected your data to comparing that to a completely unknown quantity. And that's effectively what happens a lot, because the context is the most important element of how that data has been acquired. And that's normally the missing piece. So I think as many companies now are trying to push, hey, we've got this normative data for, American football athletes, soccer athletes, whatever it might be. What rarely comes through is, well, A, are you ethical in the way in which you acquired that data in the first place? And B, is the inputs in terms of the quality of that data actually something that you've considered and that you've qualified before then you're sharing that in your system for your users to be able to compare their athletes to? And it does end up leading you, unfortunately, down potentially making decisions around training for the athlete or patient that's erroneous, because you've based your decision on data where you've got no idea on how it's been compiled. So it's a huge problem, and it's one that we're tackling in a way in which we think is the most appropriate and, in the end, useful way and most applicable way for people that use our tech.
Get CEUs faster, cheaper, and more convenient than ever before with Strength Coach Network. Hey, it's Justin, here to tell you about how Strength Coach Network can now help you out with our premium membership and CEUs to the NSCA and CSCCA. Upon signing up for our premium membership, you will get 2.0 or 10 CEUs immediately. That is an entire year's worth of CEUs that you are able to access from the convenience of your office. No traveling for conferences, no waiting on flights, no eating out, no expensive hotels. Just the good stuff from great coaches. Now, if you need extra CEUs for past years during the reporting period, we can bundle Fundamentals 1 or 2, which also come with 2.0 or 10 CEUs to your purchase. That way you're able to take care of your CEUs for the best price, most convenient, and learn from some of the best coaches. If you want more help with this, email us at service@strengthcoachnetwork or visit us at strengthcoachnetwork.com, and I would be delighted to help you out. Anybody that's not watching the video and you're listening, you're missing me shake my head, and I got goosebumps right now because I couldn't agree with you more. And from a coaching aspect, this hits a chord, and I'm going to talk for 60 seconds and then I'll give it back to you and you can spin it off of this. But the fact that Kyle Hashimoto, I know you're listening to this, you're now at UCLA, we worked together at Towson. He was the one that said this. There was people in charge that wanted us to get a piece of a device called the tracer, and it was going to tell us how the athletes moved, but we were completely neglecting the fact of everything that you just said, the methodological procedures of how the data is going to be collected. And then we were supposed to compare all these athletes, even though they don't play the same sport. It's not going to be consistent with how things are collected. They wanted us, those same admin wanted us to compare field hockey squat to the track and field squat. And I was like, wait a minute, you're literally allowing them to get a quarter squat depth and I'm full squat depth, and we're supposed to compare them. You have 4 hands on the bench press as the spotter. Like, you're doing no due diligence, and you're completely negating the fact that it's the athlete versus themselves and the athletes versus their own peer group within your team. Not like, oh, okay, hey, I'm Justin Lehman, I need to know what, Towson football does because I play, and I want to know what, Elon does, or like other teams in the CAA. It doesn't matter because Elon, Villanova, or when I was at Iowa, oh, well, what does Ohio State do? Or what does Michigan do? Who cares? We're not running their offense. We're not running their defense. We're not running their special teams. All those things affect it. And coaches need to understand, if you're listening to this, it's about you and your team and how they compare to their peer groups there and how they compare themselves to themselves over time with clean data. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Sorry.
No, 100%. I think you've hit the nail on the head there with that last statement, that the best source of normative data is your own data, where you understand exactly what the inputs are. That is the best source of data, because you're in control of all of the variables that otherwise would be uncertain. Now, I know it can take time. If you're an organization that's quite small, and you're thinking about norms, right? And you're kind of thinking about this bigger picture of whether or not your team, like how they compare to, say, a bigger group of teams that may be at the same competitive level. So you almost want to take that outward look from your own institution to somewhere else. That can only really be done if you collaborate, or at least that if there is an equivalent data set for you to compare your athletes to, that it's been collected in the same way. Because you just end up in this apple and oranges situation And although it might make you feel good in that moment, you've got a comparison to make your data to with somebody else's. In the long run, it's not really giving you a meaningful action that you can properly get behind and push forward with. And it's all of those methodological procedures that really matter. So there's a reason that with our force plates, for example, we get people to stand still and upright for a second before the test begins, that we don't allow a small amplitude counter movement jump and a squat jump, that we've got the reverse integration method in our drop jump procedures to really allow us to understand how high the athlete dropped from the box, not what the box height was when he stood on it. Like all of these elements, like no options around thresholds for like takeoff and touchdown and transition and sample frequency, just so that we know that our inputs, as far as the technology side is concerned, which is the bit that we can obviously really help to control, is as best as it can possibly be. And then through the education of our customers, we try and make sure then that everybody knows, hey, do you know what? If you're going to do a counter movement test, a jump test, these are some of the SOPs that you probably want to stick to around the bits that we can't control, which is the preparation, motivation, and education of your athletes. And I think if you nail those three things, then you're into a situation where you can actually use the data. Because don't forget, we measure with our tech, right? It's external forces. That relies on a maximal voluntary action being willingly applied by the athlete or patient. So if they don't have that buy-in around why they're doing that testing in the first place and how to execute it well, with the proper procedures done in the warm-up to get them to a point where they can really hit that well, then in the end, we're just looking at some maximal efforts, which is another thing that I wanted to mention, because I didn't mention that a minute ago. Like, how do you know that normative data set that's been taken from somewhere else actually represents a maximal effort from the athletes?
Correct.
Because that is a big question mark over that data if you don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And not to mention the fact of like, okay, you could be doing a drop jump and you could get this drop jump normative data from this people that said, okay, it was this height. But in reality, just like you said, okay, they could call it a 24-inch drop because they used a 24-inch box, but they're not taking into account the fact of it's actually not 24 inches. So now your data is again skewed, which goes back to my whole original point that no data is better than bad data, because now, oh my gosh, I can't understand this. Here's a perfect example. At Iowa, back in 2016, we were using just jump mats and the overestimation of things, right? Versus we ran a study, DeMarco and I did, and we realized, and we told Doyle, like, wait a minute, this is over, like, this is bad, where we were taking metrics from that compared to the old school force plates that we had from back in 2016. And it was like, hey, this is bad. Like, we have to fix this. And so realizing that error, and that's why eventually when I left and went to Towson, got Hawkin, like, you need to have that. And that just methodological, you have to be clean with it. And coaches have to understand that, because you now, like you said, if you're getting bad data and you're informing your decisions on training programs for these athletes, let's say you're trying to get really special and you need, we need more force application or velocity application. If you start reading research on RSI, like, that's part of the reason why this is really near and dear to my heart, because of the PhD that I did. And I also want to say, I don't think people think this is boring. I think they really do care about this now, which with more of these positions coming out, like, I think people do want to nerd out on this stuff so they can have the cleanest data and have the best data, because I do think it helps them be able to talk to their coaches and in their high performance meetings like, hey, no, this is really good, clean. This is the best of the best. We know that this is going on, especially if you have a return to play case. What's up, everybody? Taking a quick break from the show to talk about one of our sponsors, TeamBuildr. I've been using TeamBuildr since 2019 when I was at Towson. I still use it with my remote athletes. I also use it at Goldfinch, which is the private sector gym I train at, and we use it at Centennial, which is the high school that I'm working at. Now, if you're printing on lift cards because you say, oh, I can't afford TeamBuildr, guess what? TeamBuildr has a pre-written grant that you can locate on their website. You simply change the name of you, your organization, and the areas that they highlighted, and they can help you get TeamBuildr at your facility, your university, whatever it is, so that way you can optimize how you train your athletes with this software. Now, TeamBuildr is also a part owner in the Plyomat. The Plyomat is something that I utilize at Goldfinch, and it helps you be able to see how high somebody jumped, the ground contact time, and RSI. You can get all that conveniently right there. You can reach out to your rep from TeamBuildr to be able to get more information on the Plyomat. It's fast, it's reliable, it's convenient, and it's trusted by coaches worldwide. Check them out as well as TeamBuildr in the link down below.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so funny, just to go back one step, that you mentioned the Just Jump system, because that's really the first paper I published was comparing the Just Jump mat to force plates back in 2016. the first paper I published on force plates, I should say, like specifically focused on that. And I was in the same situation as you, where the numbers in a certain region, I was working as an S&C coach in netball for the northwest of England, and we had these regional centres around the country. But everyone was using different tech and then trying to pull all the data together so that the national team could select athletes based on their physical profile. And as you can imagine, the numbers were literally all over the place. And I was like, either I'm the worst strength coach in the world, which is entirely possible, by the way, or there's something wrong with the tech, because I use force plates and everybody else was using that other system. But it's important. I mean, it is important. And I do think you're right that people are actually interested in trying to find out more, because people have been collecting data, like I said. You could argue GPS was the first bit technology that was kind of broadly adopted, like en masse, right? About 10, 12 years ago, whatever that might be. And then it's evolved over time. So you end up with all of these different systems that can obviously work and provide some insights into different elements of physical profiling for athletes and monitoring. So you need to check that your system's valid, first and foremost, because that's what we were just talking about then with the jump mats. But then second of all, then, once you've got that data, instead of just collecting it, actually sit back and go through that scientific method of like, what problem are you trying to solve through putting your athlete or patient through this testing battery in the first place? Because I do feel like there's been a lot of collecting data that could, in theory, like disengage athletes. You know, if they feel like they're on a conveyor belt going from one test to another test to another, and we're not really thinking about that as scientists about why we're actually doing that test in the first place, or those series of tests, then of course it's going to affect the motivation. And then it comes back to that submaximal effort element that I mentioned before, where, you know, we've all had athletes that just go through the motions. If you see an athlete do a counter movement jump and you know that they're capable of more, but they're not giving it because they're just so fed up of being tested, then it's our job to make sure actually that now we take this seriously and we really dial in why we're doing tests that we're doing, what metrics we're choosing and why, and how does that fit into that neuromuscular profile on the side of force assessment, at least, that we can really use for return to sport, fatigue monitoring, profiling for talent ID, gym training program design, whatever it might be being applied to.
You said the word reliable and valid, and I don't want to assume that our listeners do or don't know what those words mean. So can you briefly just touch on them for the average listener that's like, wait a minute, they keep throwing these words around. I think they mean the exact same thing. Let's just define them to be able to move forward properly for anybody that's listening right now.
Yeah, 100%. So validity is really referring to accuracy. So does the system measure what it's supposed to measure effectively? So is it measuring it well? So if it's jump height, for example, like, is the tech that you're using actually giving you an accurate measure of jump height? So reliability is then looking at how repeatable that measurement is over time. So can you apply that jump height assessment on multiple occasions and get a fairly stable, consistent measure over time? So you can have a system that's not valid. So let's say it's always out by 15%, let's say, but it's consistently out by 15%, and your athletes could technically get a reliable result in terms of like seeing needle movement, but you're always going to be out by 15%. So ideally you want a system that's both valid and reliable. So it's actually measuring accurately the qualities that you're trying to measure in the first place, and it isn't out by X% or more. But that it's also reliable, so it means that if you're doing repeated measurements like we do with weekly, daily monitoring, for example, that it allows you to look at needle movements that can go beyond the just the random nature that some tech can give you the numbers, and you just end up in a situation where you can be in a situation where you have tech that isn't valid and isn't reliable. So it's not measuring what it's supposed to measure, and it also isn't doing it consistently, and that's the worst situation to be in. So it's important to obviously go and validate. Do your homework. Like, check out the system you're using, make sure they've been validated, make sure it's giving you reliable data. That reliable data goes back to all of that standardization that we already discussed around how the data has been collected in the first place, in addition to how well you execute that test setup as a coach. So are you being consistent yourself? That's the bit that we can't really control as a company. But once you're actually on our tech and that tech's actually acquiring data, that's the bit that we take care of. So you've got the technological side of testing, which is what we make sure is as valid and reliable as possible. But it's only as good as the input from the user. So that's why they need to make sure that they're being consistent, you're not moving too many things between testing occasions, so that you can help to develop this profile for your athletes over a longer period of time in a really consistent way that shows genuine change.
You teed it up perfectly about weekly and daily testing. Talk to everybody about the importance of tags and how that can help your data even better when you're on the back end and you're really chewing on it and you're looking at everything that you're learning about with your athletes. What's up, everybody? Taking a quick break from the show to talk about one of our sponsors, Hawkin Dynamics. I've been using Hawkin Dynamics ever since I was at Towson. Still utilize it today when I'm at the private sector at Goldfinch. Even brought the plates from Goldfinch over to Centennial to do some force plate testing with the football team there. We've done force plate testing with other high school athletes. It is something that you need to get. If you want more help with it about how to practically use it and you want to reach out to us, feel free to reach out to us at service@strengthcoachnetwork.com. Not only do I utilize it with lower body assessments, I use it with upper body assessments, plyo push-ups, prone Y assessments. You can also utilize it for what I call an upper body isometric mid thigh pull, where essentially you're doing a push up at the strongest range and you're pushing into an immovable force, so a barbell, same way you do an isometric mid thigh pull. Like I said, been using them for years. Valid, reliable. The customer service is fantastic. Go check out Hawkin Dynamic in the link down below, and you will not be disappointed.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, at Hawkin we have a tagging system, and that allows you just to put your context around like the different types of tests and when you will do them. So, for example, if you're doing like a pre and post match test, or a match day plus 1 or 2 or 3, depending on what language you use, if you're in soccer or other sports, then it just allows you to make sure that you've got like a stamp like of exactly what that test or when that test was done. It could be that, for example, with a counter movement jump, you might want to do some arm swing based counter movement jumps for a jump dominant sport like volleyball, basketball, or whatever it might be. But you want to do a hands on hips counter movement jump for the actual isolation of that neuromuscular profile for the athlete. So our tagging system just allows you to almost put that note on there to allow you to know exactly under the counter movement jump test or the isometric mid thigh pull test or the drop jump test what those conditions were. And then that allows us then to pull that information through into the cloud reports, where you can actually start to bucket your tests based on the different types of testing that you might have done. So arm swing versus no arm swing, pre-match versus post-match, week 1 pre-match versus week 2 pre-match, and all of these different combinations. So it's just to streamline that ability to then take the information through into a cloud that visualizes that data for you, which is then the most effective way to communicate that back to your coaches and your athletes.
Yeah, and that's something that I talked about on the episode with it was oh my gosh, why am I forgetting his name? Matt Jordan, and we talked about it. Where again, like I'm talking about doing stuff for the upper body and tagging it that way, or using the free run if you're going to have athletes performing different movements. Like you can create those tags and then look on it on the back end.
100%. I mean, it becomes more complex if you're doing something like a shoulder, for example, where you might have multiple positions. Doing an isometric based assessment for every single one of those different positions. So it might be the I, Y, and T for the ASH test, for example. It could be internal rotation and external rotation that you're tagging. So what it allows us to do in an efficient way is just allow the user to just put the tag on there to explain what those conditions were underneath the umbrella of isometric test or counter movement jump test or multi-rebound test. And then it allows them to pass out those bits afterwards in the cloud to build the reports. And once you've built those templates, it will automatically then pull in that information based on those tags. So once you set that up, you're kind of good to go. And then you can have that efficient battery that you have moving forward. And we can do that as well within the drop jump now, where we've actually got like an update that we had in January, where we have a reverse integration method, which gives us the gold standard measurement of drop jump performance, basically, in terms of how we actually measure that data once the athlete's contacted the force plates. So we've added an auto tag for that, and that's just to give that quality assurance that the athletes met the criteria to qualify for that method to be applied. So it's a bit like with a squat jump, where you're trying to stay nice and still, avoid that pre-amplitude counter movement, that cheeky dip before they jump, and we don't let tests pass if they end up going and doing that particular pre-amplitude counter movement element. But with a drop jump, what we're looking for in the end is like, did they stay still at the end? Because if they did stand still and upright at the end, we can reverse integrate the data, and that allows us to give you the best possible drop jump method that currently exists on the market. So that'll give us like an auto tag. So there's like different ways you can put the tag in yourself. In this case, it's an auto tag so that you know which method's been applied to that drop jump protocol. So that's like a relatively new change for us, just at the middle of January, I think it was.
Talking about new and talking about, okay, hey, this is normative data, making sure everything's done right. Can you lay out some like, all right, if doing this test, follow these procedures. If doing this test, follow these procedures. So that way, a ton of our listeners know they have Hawkin already. And so they're using the software and they're using the hardware, lay it out for them like, okay, as of right now, March 2025, this is how you should be doing it to have the best of the best. Because like you just said, that little update from January.
Yeah, just you made me think of one thing before I dive into that, if that's okay.
Go right ahead.
The normative data, by the way, everybody thinks they talk about big data, right? Actually, there's research that shows once you hit about 85 people or samples in a normative data set, it actually, beyond that, doesn't really change the normative data set. So that's just one thing I meant to say before. Like, people think they need like 10,000, if that even exists, probably not in sport, like it does for the general population, like huge data sets to qualify to be classed as normative data. In fact, if you get to about 80 to 85 people, like within a positional group, so it could be like offensive linemen, for example, in American football, like you will then have, in 90% of cases, stable means and standard deviations, which represent that population. And if you were to go from 80 people to 200 people in that data set, it isn't really going to alter your decision making. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I said a point before about being patient, trying to let your normative data grow in your authentic context. It's actually not as big as a requirement as some people might think, based on the evidence of like how much data it needs to give you stable means and standard deviations from which you calculate your z-scores, your t-scores, standard 10 scores, even percentiles for that matter. So depending on which approach you prefer to take. In terms of the tests, like for the drop jump, I'll just clarify that one more time. The problem that we used to have, and everyone used to have in the scientific literature, is that the athlete isn't starting on the plate. So we make an assumption that the height of the box is the height they fell from, and that determines the velocity they hit the force plates with. But we all know from coaching that that assumption is going to be fundamentally flawed. But that's in 99% of research studies. So I published a paper back in 2021 on proposing how we can overcome that. There was another paper that came out at the same time, ironically, in the same month. And we just get the athletes to stand still at the end of the test, unlike they do at the start of the test for a counter movement jump, a squat jump, a CMJ rebound, and all of those tests that people are now familiar with. And then what that does is allows us to get from force and time to acceleration, velocity, power, and displacement, going from the end of the test to the start rather than the start to the test to the end. So that's that. So that's a big change. So if you're doing a drop jump, stand still and upright for the last second of the trial. That allows a reverse integration method to be applied by our system. If you're not doing that in any other system that you're using, then it's impossible for that reverse integration method to be applied, and therefore you're going to get like our fallback method, which is where people maybe don't land back on the plate, so we have to provide a different route. For CMJ, stand still and upright. Now, we always talk about stand still. We forget the upright sometimes because the counter movement depth and metrics like that you might be interested in is all based on the assumption that that first 1 second, we set that displacement or position to 0, and then we calculated any change in range of motion from that 0 point. So you see athletes sometimes where they slightly flex at the hips. That's going to have an impact on your day-to-day monitoring of a CMJ if that's what you're using. So still and upright, not just still, is probably the key message to get across if you haven't done that already for counter movement jumps, CMJ rebounds, and multi-rebound jumps. And then pick an option, whether you're going to go just aiming for jumping high or jumping fast and high. Because a lot of the time people use those cues interchangeably, and that's going to influence the strategy that's employed by the athlete. So if you're in a jump dominant sport, you might want to focus on the jump high cue, which is fine. If you're interested in trying to get this understanding of how high can an athlete jump for a given short amount of time spent producing the force to propel them in that jump, then cue fast and high. But don't use the two terms interchangeably. That's something I've been seeing quite a lot at the moment, where if you've got multiple people that are involved in that data collection in your organization, just make sure you're calibrated, that it's not just about setting the force plates up in the same way, it's also about the words that come out of our mouths as well. And it will influence even the basic jumps like a CMJ, which is probably the most common test that anybody does, right? But it does have a big enough impact on the data from that. For things like the isometric mid-thigh pull, I'm sure people are starting to come onto this now anyway, but the fact that it's called a pull has probably been the biggest pain in the ass, I've got to say, around that test, right? And that's no discredit to the guys like Greg Harp, etc. that were involved. I know Greg well, right? So I know where it comes from, and it makes sense if you're a weightlifter and you're testing weightlifters. But it's a push. It's a push through the feet. It's a pull if you're using a strain gauge, but if you're using force plates, it's a push. So this is one thing. My good friend Paul Comfort and I We kind of changed up our queuing a while ago, and so did now Greg Half, Jason Lake, all the other people, Nick Ripley, etc., that have been involved in our circles to queue push. And it does make a big difference on the actual peak forces and the rate of force development you get. So if you're stood there right now looking at any of your athletes doing an iso pull, thinking, "Wow, this guy can squat 200 kilos in the gym, but he's only getting 2,000 newtons in an iso pull," I bet you any money it's because they're pulling like crazy on a bar that's on a fixed rig, and they're not actually pushing through the force plates, which is the bit that we're actually measuring. So cue push instead of pull. That'll make a big difference. Wear straps if you're really interested in isolating the strength of the lower legs. Makes about 15 to 20% difference in favour of increased peak force for isometric mid-thigh pull if you're going to go down that route. And if you're having problems with the iso pull, then just switch it to a belt squat, because I honestly feel like the belt squat is going to overcome, and is overcoming some of the issues that we have. And then the last thing I'll say is don't disqualify trials for plyometric tests like drop jumps, rebound jumps, etc. if they don't hit that sub 250 millisecond criteria that's been used since about 1992 when Schmidt-Bleicher kind of first wrote about it in his textbook. And that's been something that's been pushed out in a journal article at the back end of last year. And the reason is that we want to cue athletes to be springy off the ground, punch the ground away, to really give us that kind of fast stretch shortening cycle plyometric based test. But if you're comfortable that they are really trying to execute that short contact time, but for love nor money they just literally can't bring it under 250 milliseconds, then that's telling you what you need to know about that athlete, that perhaps actually the plyometric training is what they need to focus on if their numbers are up on the maximal strength and the ballistic tests. I think a lot of people have been trying to be too focused on that, and almost coaching athletes to really get the contact time down. But then, of course, what comes with that is you sacrifice the output, so the jump heights will start to reduce. So you kind of need to maybe not be so tunnel visioned on certain elements within the jump. Just watch the athletes in front of you, try and make sure that they're executing the test based on what you know as their coach to their best ability, and then use that information then to understand whether or not you need to intervene in terms of a training program. And I said it was the last thing, but I always say this a lie. I'm a recovering academic, by the way, so I'm trying. Asymmetries. Just one thing I want to say on asymmetries. Don't get tunnel vision on that either, because a lot of people focus on the magnitude of asymmetry, but very, very rarely unpack that into how that asymmetry was achieved. And what I mean by that is you could have somebody that's asymmetrical and strong, and they're probably in a better situation than someone that's perfectly symmetrical but weak. So instead of focusing just on asymmetries, and I'm talking mainly to our clinical users here that like to tend to focus on that a bit more, is still unpack that into the left and right contributions to that asymmetry to understand whether or not you've got an athlete that's asymmetrical and weak, because that's worse than an athlete that's asymmetrical and strong in terms of potential for injury risk and also their ability to recover from fatiguing elements like match play training, etc.
What's up, y'all? Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about another one of our sponsors, Vitruve. I've been utilizing Vitruve for a while now, and I absolutely love the convenience of this app. The encoder is at a price that you cannot beat compared to the competitors. Also, I don't personally like the camera apps. I've known that they continue to break down, and I really enjoy having this encoder attached directly to the bar. Vitruve does that. Not only does it do that, but it'll show me velocity loss during the set, shows me average velocity, all of it right within the app. Not only that, for the app on the individual athlete, there's a Vitruve Teams app where now as the coach, I can see all the results from my athletes. I can API that into my team builder, and now everything that I'm trying to do, get better competition, better intent in the weight room, I am able to do with Vitruve. If you want more information about them, click the link down below, or you can ask us questions directly at service@strengthcoachnetwork.com, and we would love to answer those questions for you. First thing, let's stay on the asymmetry before I ask the other question I have. What would, if anyone's listening, they're like, all right, man, what is too high of a number? What do I need to be, staying within before, where are my guardrails to stay safe and do good?
Love that question. And the reason I love that question is by the time this podcast comes out, we'll have a new feature in our system which will be on asymmetry. So this is great. Unless you're going to tell me this comes out today, in which case I've revealed this too soon.
It's going to come out next week, my man.
Yeah, there we go. So Monday next week, this is now Friday, just for reference, okay?
Yep.
We will have a new asymmetry feature both in our app and also in our cloud report. And that allows you to actually draw lines in the sand. That's the question you're asking me right now, right? So how do you draw a proper line in the sand to understand what is actually a warning or critical asymmetry that you might want then to explore a little bit further? So the usual approach is to use arbitrary 10, 12, or 15% as cutoffs. And all three of those have been used extensively in the scientific literature, sometimes 20% as well. The novel approach to asymmetry comes back to this whole normative data piece, and that's about using cutoffs based on the standard deviations of the asymmetry for your athletes. So let's say, for example, you've got an average braking force asymmetry of 6%. Like, there's three approaches that have been now adopted in the literature. You either go that 6% plus 0.2 of a standard deviation, and that 0.2 is what often is referred to as the smallest worthwhile change. So it's basically 0.2 times the standard deviation of those numbers that you've got for, say, average braking force across all of your athletes in your data set. So, for example, if the standard deviation is 1, so it's 6% is the average asymmetry, 1% is the standard deviation, then 0.2 of that would obviously be 0.2%, just to keep the numbers nice and easy. So 0.2%, 0.5%, 0.2 of a standard deviation, 0.5 of a standard deviation, or 1 standard deviation based on that particular population and that particular test metric asymmetry. And the reason that people are moving towards that approach in the scientific research is because what that allows us to do is to understand whether or not the asymmetry is beyond typical for that athlete population group or that position group at that level of play, based on each individual metric, rather than just using a blanket 10% or a 15% cutoff, because that could either be too conservative or it could be way too sensitive. And you've kind of got to try and understand, with this whole taking data seriously argument, like, where do you want your line in the sand to be? Because if you go 10% for some metrics, you might end up missing a chunk of athletes that actually have a meaningful asymmetry that you maybe want to follow up with the medical staff with, because it's too large of a bandwidth. Whereas you can have the opposite effect if you go the other way. So we'll look out for that. We've got a blog post that's coming out to support this innovation in both our cloud and our mobile app on Monday next week, where it'll explain how to apply these cutoffs. But that does come back, though, the caveats are to you being able to take your data that you've collected in our system or any other system you might be using, and then plot the normal distribution of those asymmetry values, and then draw your line in your sands for, like, average braking force, average propulsive force, average landing force, braking RFD, like whatever the things are that you think are important for your athletes in terms of profiling. You can then put those in, and then you can be sure, a bit like with using measurement error to track change over time in any other metric, you're drawing a line in the sand that's actually based on meaningful data rather than arbitrary 10%, 12%, 15% cutoffs.
You mentioned standard deviation, you mentioned Z-score, and I was mentoring a coach the other day on how to analyze their data, and I took it for granted, like, oh, I thought everybody knew what a Z-score is and standard deviation. Can you, again, let's let you be the expert. You talked about reliability and validity. Let's talk about those numbers and normative data and, the standard deviation of plus minus 1 and 2 and, the extremes with that.
100%. So we have whenever we collect our data, say we've got 100 athletes and we've got jump height, let's just use that as an easy example. We can look at the normal distribution of that data, and if we've got a good sample of 80 or more athletes, the likelihood is that we're going to have normally distributed data for metrics like jump height and everything else. What that allows us to do is to understand what is the distribution of that data around the average. So the average being the mean is what we take with normally distributed data. So when we calculate a mean and a standard deviation, that is equivalent to a Z-score of 0 and plus or minus a score of 1. And what that basically tells us is, but let me go back one step actually, a Z-score is a standardized score. So instead of talking about things like means and standard deviations from which it's derived, the idea is that it makes it simpler. So instead of just reporting the average, a Z-score that's equal to the average would be 0. And then you've got a bunch of numbers that are going to be to the right of 0 and a bunch of numbers that are going to be to the left. And to the right, that means that they're above the standard deviation. And say if they're 1 standard deviation above the mean, that would give you a Z-score of 1. If they're 2 standard deviations above the mean, it'll give you a z-score of 2. If they're 2 standard deviations below the mean, so below average, that'll give you a z-score of -2 and -1 or -0.5. So it's a way of standardizing that normal distribution of data into something that allows us to then plot that based on a 0 reference being the mean, and then whether you're above or below that mean or that 0 line. Some people still struggle with that as a concept though. So we have something called a t-score, which basically multiplies the z-score by 10 and then adds 50. What that basically does is that gives us a range or a standardized score out of 100. And that's something that resonates much better because our kids are all walking around with like top trump cards, football cards, whatever it might be, where you now have player attributes using FIFA or whatever you might be playing on the Xbox or the PlayStation, right? Where players have attributes that are kind of built usually on a scale up to 100. So that basically takes that z-score approach and puts it on a scale that people are more familiar with. So now if you get a score of 50, that's equal to a z-score or a z-score, sorry, to do it in American English, of 0, and is equal to the mean or average for the group. If you get a z-score of 2, which is 2 standard deviations above the mean, so very much above the mean, that would then turn that into a t-score of 70. So it's much easier for us then as coaches to say, hey dude, you've done really well in this test, you scored 80 out of 100. That sounds good. If I say to you, you've scored 3 in a z-score, you're going to be like, what the hell does that mean? Yeah. So the idea about it is actually to be test and metric agnostic. So we basically, instead of saying this is your jump height in centimeters, this is your peak velocity in meters per second, this is your RFD in Newton seconds, the benefit of standardized scores like z-scores and t-scores is it takes the actual dimensions out of the numbers and the units and just reports it on a scale. I would say though that z-scores tend to be more useful to academics and statisticians that are used to operating in that space, whereas the t-scores I think is much more useful for us. Or a standard 10 scores is the same concept. Instead of a scale of 0 to 100, it's a 0 to 10 scale. And so that allows you then to go back to your athletes and give them something that they can work out. So what's my score out of 100? What's my score out of 10? That's easy. And then it allows us to plot athletes in relation to each other as well. And then we can look and see in relation to each other, irrespective of the numbers in terms of the units of measurement, like is that athlete above or below another athlete? Or is that athlete above or below what they were at a previous testing session that you did? So it's to try and remove the numbers, which works once you're confident with where the data's come from and you understand those metrics in the first place. Then you can simplify it and then put it on an easy scale, z-score, t-score, standard 10, whatever you need. I think they tend to work a bit better than percentiles in my opinion. I still think percentiles are a bit of a block or barrier for adoption in sports science and tech. So yeah, like we have z-scores and t-scores in our system, and that just allows you to just take the information that's relatively complex to most people and just put it in a very simple format for them to try and track over time.
Yeah, my athlete, when I was like, dude, you're like 2.5 standard DV. They're like, what do you like? I'm there now. And I'm like, that's awesome. You know what I mean? They're like, coach, I don't speak in English, please. Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Powerlift. I used Powerlift when I was at Harvard, Maryland, and the University of Iowa. I was also part of the staff that had the new weight room at the University of Iowa, the 32 rack, beautiful facility. I was a part of that. I also have Powerlift's equipment nowadays. Powerlift Strong, made here in the great state of Iowa in the great country of the United States. They're able to work with you on any customizations that you need, logos, height, whatever it is, the limitations that you have. Their equipment is strong. The people there, they're very good people. Check them out in the link down below. And if you have any questions on how to work with them, reach out to us at service@strengthcoachnetwork.com and we would be delighted to help.
Yeah, so you scored 70 out of 100 then. I mean, okay, that's good. Is that good? Well, it's above the mean by 2 whole chunks. I mean, that's pretty good. You're heading in the right direction. I think that's the key thing, Yeah, like we use that quite a lot. We've used that in previous studies that I've done. We've created a scale actually in a paper that I published in 2022 that created T-score bands. So we gave some qualitative descriptions, so above average, below average, all the way from very poor up to excellent on the range. And then we colour banded it using a traffic light system as well. So if at the very minimum, if you've got an athlete that's no good at interpreting numbers, you can kind of show them on that scale where they land, or green for good, red for bad, that kind of concept. One thing I've just missed off that's important, if you've got a number that becomes increasingly negative, but that's a good thing, And what I mean by that is when you measure, say, things like on the downward phase, peak powers, peak velocities, that's going to give you an increasingly negative number that is better the more negative it becomes. Or if you take things like a time to take off in a counter movement jump, so how long did it take you from when you initiated the jump to when you took off, a smaller number is better because that's telling us that the athletes performed that jump over a shorter time. So the important step that I didn't clarify there is you have to flip those scores, those Z-scores first. Otherwise your scale will be off and you'll be giving credit to the athletes that are the slowest or the least powerful in the braking phase rather than the other way around.
Yep, you're correct. I remember doing that with our sprint times when I Z-scored everybody for that as well. Question that I had too, within your tagging, is it important for the isometric mid-thigh push to tag it belt, bar with strap? Like, is it important to get that finite in your opinion?
Yeah, I love how you said isometric mid-thigh push. We need to create a campaign, and maybe this is it.
Let's do it.
Forum, right? Yeah, I mean, it depends. I would say if you're always going to do the same test type, so let's say you always do isometric mid-thigh push with straps, then you don't have to tag it if that's the only isometric test that you're doing. The chances are these days, though, that people might want to do an isometric hamstring test, they might want to do an isometric groin test, they might want to do an isometric shoulder test, and so on and so forth. So that's where it does become important to put the tags in there. And I would go into that granular detail as well. And the reason being is if you can change your tags afterwards. So let's say you get too excited and you put too many tags in there and you've kind of made it slightly too complicated and you think, actually, I can dial that back a bit. Then you can just change the tags afterwards. That's fine. But I would say at the very least, you can do it in two ways. You either do simple tags and then you know in your mind or you've made notes on exactly what you did at which time, fine. Or you can go add one or two tags on there so that you've got all bases covered. So this is a unilateral left-sided isometric mid-thigh push performed with straps. So you might have left leg straps, IMTP, or something like that. But I do think you need to pre-plan them though, because otherwise you could end up with a whole bunch of tags. It can make things too complicated, you know. So you can make one big tag instead. So you might have, instead of three separate tags that are left side, isometric mid-thigh pull, and straps, you could just consolidate that into one tag. And if that's something that you're going to do consistently over time, that will allow you then to neatly bucket that data into one spot and then pull it through into the cloud afterwards.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more for coaches to sit back and kind of chew on how you're going to be utilizing the data and how you're going to envision it to create your tags, because that's what we did at Goldfinch. Like, okay, it's going to be this, like this, okay. And you just sit back and like set a period of time in your day, like, hey, this is our R&D time. Instead of programming time or time where we're on the floor, sit back. How can we effectively work on the system, not in the system? And that will help you work in the system even more effectively.
Absolutely. The other thing that we do is something called groups within teams. So let's say, for example, you're going to stratify your team out into different subgroups, and that might be based on age group. It might be based on like positional groups, like forwards and backs in rugby. Like you can do that in the moment, but actually you can also do it retrospectively in our system as well. And it's the same with tags. So I think sometimes it's important to plan, don't get me wrong, but sometimes you don't really know what the difference is going to be between when we sit down as a group and we plan something and then how it actually turns out in practice, you know, as you start to get further down the rabbit hole and start to really explore the data. So it's important just to know that you can go back in the system and retrospectively add athletes into certain subgroups or add tags that weren't there before. As long as you've obviously got that kind of track record of exactly what it is that you've done and you know it, you can go back in and edit that at a later date. And I think that's important for research projects. We have a lot of academics that use our system with students that will be doing dissertations and things, or like PhDs. So there's no reason for them to panic. If they change their mind that the research line is going to change slightly, they can go back into the system and change these things afterwards and then click the button, and then it will automatically then pull those athletes into the right format that they need.
We've been chopping it up for just under an hour. What would be kind of your closing statement or kind of big thing that you really wanted to hammer home and make sure coaches like understood at the end of this conversation?
So key points are trust. You've got to trust the data. I think it all comes down to trust. Like for us, like we're a force measurement solutions company that's built upon trust, and that trust comes from our tech, but it also comes from our people. And in fact, actually, without those two coincided with each other in the way that it does, then it doesn't work. And I think the key thing is you've got to trust the data of any tech that you're using. So go and check the website out, make sure there's no black box approach, go and make sure you know where the numbers come from. For example, we've got a metric database, and that'll tell you exactly how all of our metrics are defined, right? Make sure you can export your data. That's another important step. For me to come on board in this company 14 months ago as a previous associate professor of sport and exercise biomechanics, the only company I would have come to is Hawkin Dynamics, because I'm a force assessment nerd. And for me, this is the company that's always been leading the way. So with that, it comes as an academic. I want to check the workings out. So I want to be able to export the force time data and actually check that with my own algorithms. I'm not saying your average user would do that, but it's important though, and we allow that. So if you want to go and check the numbers, make sure that it's actually doing what we say it does. Then you should have that ability to do that with any tech that you're using, in my opinion, because that does build trust. The second thing is take some time to actually understand the data. Like, don't move too fast. All of those metrics that are calculated from a jump, you might get 80, for example, from a counter movement jump. They're always going to be there, but it doesn't mean that you should be doing some fishing exercise and trying to cast the net so wide and track all of them at the same time. It's counterproductive. There are 5 metrics that I think you should start with. You choose those 5 metrics, and then if you start to understand a bit more and you want to unpack it, then you go into maybe some of those other 75 metrics or whatever we have in our system to go and unpack that as you become more kind of familiar with what it is that you're looking for. I think a lot of people get the tech, and I've been there myself as well, so I'm not criticizing, but it's really easy to go into the weeds real fast because there's so much that you can do. But there's very rarely been an experience that I've had where somebody's adopted that approach, where it's actually really led to effective change with their athletes or patients. It's only when you take that step back, really plan it, dial in exactly what it is that you want to focus on. Less is definitely more to begin with. And hey, if something weird happens, that you get a mad flag on the asymmetry, or you've got somebody that's absolutely bombed like on MRSI or something like that, then you can go and interrogate the data a little bit more. But you've kind of got to have that basic model first. It's the only real way to progress. There's so many faddy things that you see on social media now. Oh, this is the new metric everybody should be doing, and like this is the new test. It's so easy to get distracted. If we actually was reactive to every single post we saw on social media, we would never make any progress because we're always going to be moving the goalposts. So the last thing, just to finish, is just consistency. Once you've actually vetted the tech that you're using, you've got a model that you're happy with for return to sport, for fatigue monitoring, for physical profiling, then just try and stick with it for at least a period of time that allows you to see whether or not it checks out and does what you want it to do, rather than just being too giddy and getting 2 weeks in and then seeing something else on Instagram and then flicking to a totally different protocol. Because that's just not going to progress anybody, not least the athletes and patients who are meant to be at the center of why we're doing all this in the first place.
That's a perfect place to wrap this up, man. Thank you very much for coming on and educating me and the rest of our listeners. You have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching that video. If you enjoyed it, click right here for videos just like that, and make sure you click here to subscribe to our channel. Have a great rest of your day.